Hello, Jantina, are you there?
Hello, I am.
Yes. So you are welcome to start. Do you want to just check if the slides can you control the slides? I gave you control.
Okay, yes, I think I can. All right. Hello, everyone.
It's not moving on my side yet.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, you are welcome to go.
Excellent. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having the Ethics Lab be involved in what sounds like a really successful forum. So today's discussion will feature Dr. Heidi Matheson, who will share with you some ideas around value-based healthcare considerations for expensive medications and rare diseases. I just want to reiterate a couple of housekeeping rules, which are that you can find the recordings as instructed on the slides. You can add any questions or comments to the chat box. You can send a request for to be added to the mail list to Melanie, and the email address is on the slide. And same for CPD points. If you have any queries, please contact Melanie. If not, everything should be automatic. And then the organizing team, Gerdien, Estelle, and others would really value your feedback. So at the end of the Zoom meeting, please, if you can stay on a little bit longer to complete anonymous feedback on the session, which I'm sure they'll share with us as well. So the deep dive management team, I'm sure you are all familiar, is Estelle Verburg, the national coordinator Gerdien Kritzinger, and Melanie Davids for administration. So that is the team. And then today's discussion, as I said, is going to be a lecture or a seminar in ethics. Hopefully you'll find that interesting. And then it had a link on next week. I don't know what you're doing next week. So Heidi Matheson is a senior lecturer in bioethics based at UCT in what we call the Ethics Lab that I direct. We focus on thinking about ethics in the context of new and emerging health technologies particularly. We're based in the Neuroscience Institute at UCT and in the Faculty of Health Sciences, therefore, in the Department of Medicine. Heidi is a philosopher who originally obtained her PhD from the London School of Economics and immediately in the past worked on the South African Research Ethics Training Initiative based at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, from where she joined us at UCT. Heidi's expertise is in moral philosophy, bioethics, and research ethics. And in her current role at UCT, she's starting to spend quite a lot of time thinking about and building ideas around moral resilience among healthcare professionals. And I think she's quite keen to share some of those ideas in this lecture too. And with that, I'll hand over to Heidi, who should be on the call for her talk.
Hi, everyone. I will just start with my video so you get some sense of whose voice you will be hearing, but I'll switch it off just to save bandwidth. I just want to get this into the right format. Right, so thank you, Jantina, for the introduction, and to Gerdien and Estelle for inviting me to this seminar series of Hematology Deep Dive. As we've heard, I'm going to sort of be talking about value-based healthcare considerations for expensive medicines and rare diseases. And just to give you a brief outline of how things are going to go, hopefully, in the first part, which is going to be quite brief, I'm going to cover some definitions, prevalence and distribution, and then some ethical principles involved in discussions about treating or not treating rare diseases. And then I'm going to raise some concerns. I'm not going to speak a lot about rare diseases, mainly because so many of them are difficult to pronounce. So I'm going to, rather in part 2, suggest an alternative approach, and that is the approach of severity rather than rarity. And then I'm going to give you some ethical principles, namely narrative theory and fair innings, to try and support this idea that we're focusing on the wrong thing. And then I'm going to try and end by offering some hope for a way forward, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions and answers. Right, now if this would just move, we could go ahead. Okay, so some definitions. Value-based healthcare is, as you can see, a healthcare delivery model that seeks to provide the best possible care to patients while optimizing the use of resources. So we're assuming a resource-constrained environment and patients in need. And when it comes to expensive medications for rare diseases, there are several value-based considerations that healthcare systems, providers, and policymakers take into account. So primarily, these include cost effectiveness, for example, calculating the cost per quality adjusted life year gained to determine whether the medication provides good value for the money spent. We can also consider balancing long and short-term benefits. Because some rare diseases are chronic and lifelong, we need to assess not only short-term outcomes, but also the potential for sustained improvement. In this regard, it's therefore important to focus on patient-centered outcomes. So considering the impact of the medication or treatment on patients' quality of life. For rare diseases where there may be limited treatment options, improvements in patient-reported outcomes should be given significant weight. Similarly, involving patient advocacy groups in decision-making processes can provide valuable insights into the impact of rare diseases and the value of specific treatments. If the disease meets the criteria for being rare, which we'll talk about in a moment, the treatment or medication may have received orphan drug designation, so there may be certain incentives and pricing considerations. Some have suggested that it may be worth exploring value-based pricing agreements with pharmaceutical companies, which tie the price of the medication to its real-world performance. So this ensures that payment aligns with the actual value delivered. Organizations such as Rare Diseases South Africa help to encourage innovation in the development of treatments for rare diseases, and such support can lead to more cost-effective solutions in the future. Finally, while it is important to think about equitable access to the medication or treatment for all eligible patients, medications are just one aspect of care. Comprehensive care plans that address other aspects of the disease, such as rehabilitation and mental health support, should also be part of a value-based approach, especially in under-resourced patients or communities. So ultimately, incorporating these and other value-based considerations into the decision-making process for expensive medications used to treat rare diseases can help healthcare systems strike a balance between providing necessary care to patients and managing costs effectively. So what do we mean when we're talking about rare diseases? It's generally used to describe conditions that affect a relatively small number of people in the population. However, some rare diseases are more common than others. So one example that I'm sure most of you will be familiar with is hemochromatosis, which is considered a rare disease because it affects fewer than 200,000 people in the United States, but it is one of the most common genetic disorders in Caucasians of Northern European descent. The white population in general has a 6 times higher likelihood of developing the disease than the Black population, and men are affected around 2 to 3 times more often than women. Similarly, what counts as rare differs. In the USA, a rare disease is that which affects up to 7 in a population of 10,000. In Europe, it must be affecting fewer than 5 in 10,000. And for the WHO, it's somewhere between 6.5 and 10 in 10,000. So in the US, we can look at albinism, for example, which affects approximately 1 in 20,000 people having some type of albinism, which is slightly lower than in Africa, where it's estimated that 1 out of 15,000 people in most subregions has the disease. Compare this, however, to Tanzania, in which 1 out of 1,400 people has the condition. So in terms of definition, it's not entirely clear what we mean when we're talking about a rare disease in a particular context. In terms of prevalence and distribution, as you can see, it's widely distributed across the whole world, with around 400 million people living with around 7,000 rare diseases. In South Africa, a rare disease affects 4.1 million of the population at any given time, which equates to around 1 in 15 people. So those of you watching the Rugby World Cup, that's 1 player in every starting lineup, or 2 at the beginning of each game. Now, when it comes to thinking about the ethical principles related to treating rare diseases or to funding expensive medications, there are 3, I think, that are the most common and come to the fore most regularly. So informing this discussion is utilitarianism, which simply put, is the greatest happiness for the greatest number, or in its simplest formulation, values the greatest utility for the greatest number of people, where utility is measured in terms of happiness. This theory or principle is commonly evoked in public health because the aim here is to maximize the health of the total population rather than that of individuals. Key aspects of utilitarianism include impartiality, that is, that everyone's happiness is equally valuable, and the best value for money. Utilitarianism is generally invoked to oppose funding, research and development, and/or treatment of rare diseases, especially in resource-constrained environments, on the basis that more value could be derived from that funding if channeled into the general population. The biomedical principle of beneficence, in contrast, supports offering help to the sick and needy, irrespective of the utility to the general population. Beneficence does, however, need to be balanced with justice. We may need to recognize the limits to beneficence in order to prevent unfairness to those who would have benefited from non-rescue medicine. The final principle or idea that I'm going to speak most about is the rule of rescue, which was coined by Albert Johnson in 1986. And it refers to the human impulse to rescue an identifiable person facing an imminent threat. This rule is often invoked in discussions about priority setting in public health care, especially with respect to offering beneficial yet very expensive treatment. It speaks to our impulse to rescue someone facing imminent danger or threat. It favors emergency care, even if there is a small chance of success, over preventative services that would benefit large groups of people. Similarly, it privileges acute care over chronic care. Now, after all that theory, I thought we'd have a small test. So on the slide in front of you are 5 images, which if you take a moment to think about what they all have in common, and you're welcome to put it in the chat or unmute yourself if that's possible. Anyone hazard a guess about what these 5 images have in common? While you're thinking about it, I'll give you a clue. Traveling, disaster, adventure, health, we're getting close. But in fact, this slide might make things a little bit clearer. So the first is a piece of wreckage from the MH370 Air Malaysia flight that disappeared in 2014. The second is an image from the Thai cave system in Chiang Rai province, northern Thailand, where in mid-2018, members of a junior association football team were trapped, but eventually rescued. The first picture on the bottom row is American cave explorer Mark Dickey, who was earlier this month rescued from one of Turkey's deepest caves, more than a week after he fell seriously ill and became too frail to make his own way out. The other picture of wreckage is from the Titan submersible, which imploded earlier this year, killing all 5 on board. And the final image is the crash site where adventurer Steve Fossett's remains were discovered 13 months after he disappeared in 2007. All of these cases highlight the very real nature of the rule of rescue. But what is often not considered is the very real cost of this impulse to save identifiable individuals in imminent danger. So to give you a reality check, the underwater search for the Air Malaysia plane cost upwards of $56 million. The Thai cave rescue of the 11 footballers and their coach cost $9 million. It's unclear what it has cost to rescue Mark Dickey, but a GoFundMe page raised $100,000 for his rescue. The Titan submersible, which did not end up rescuing the 5 people on board, cost $1.6 million, and it is estimated that almost $2 million was spent on looking for Steve Fossett's remains in the 13 months before they were found. Compare this to the fact that in 2021, there were 247 million cases of malaria worldwide, with 619,000 deaths. It's estimated that currently, almost every minute, a child under the age of 5 dies from malaria. The cost of a family-sized malaria net is $3. Now, I'm not the first person to make the point that the rule of rescue, while a natural inclination, is problematic. These concerns have not been ignored. Have a look at what the man who coined the idea of the rule of rescue said in 1986. Our moral response to the imminence of death demands that we rescue the doomed. We throw a rope to the drowning, rush into burning buildings to snatch the entrapped, dispatch teams to search for the snowbound. This rescue morality spills over into medical care, where our ropes are artificial hearts, our rush is the mobile critical care unit, our teams the transplant services. The imperative to rescue is undoubtedly of great moral significance, but the imperative seems to grow into a compulsion, more instinctive than rational. More recently, Sharon Kling has argued that as a policy, using the rule of rescue to provide unlimited expensive treatment for rare disease is not sustainable. Now, both of those were my emphasis, the bold, but I want to talk a little bit about the rule of rescue's use in medicine. And Largent and Pearson have proposed a number of constituents that make up the rule of rescue's utility. They say that individuals should be identifiable, their lives must be endangered by a disease that is severe, progressive, and results in a decreased life expectancy if left untreated. Opportunity costs are involved, and there is no existing alternative treatment. Now, I'm not going to spend time on 3 and 4. I'll take these as a given. But for the next little while, my focus will be on points 1 and 2. So back to some tests. 3 images. Anyone want to identify any of them? Okay, so Caroline got it in 1. Everyone's getting it in 1. So the image on the left of the black car remains is the image from Princess Diana's crash in the French Tunnel. Those came up pretty quickly. There is finally a response. The top image is an image from the Libyan floods that have currently devastated and killed over 11,000 people, with another 10,000 still missing. And the bottom image is of the earthquake that recently struck Marrakesh and destroyed a number of villages in Morocco. The point of these images is to bring home the idea of the identifiable individual in the rule of rescue versus statistical victims. So for many of us, myself included, it's much easier to understand and to feel sympathy or empathy with an identifiable victim, in the case of Princess Diana, than a number of 10,000, 11,000, or hundreds of thousands of people devastated by floods or earthquakes. And this artificial intimacy is both a natural and understandable impulse that humans share. But as McKee and Richardson have said, why should those who are lucky enough or manipulative enough to attract media attention be thought to have a special claim on resources? And in this regard, some have argued that the rule of rescue is discriminatory, that identifiability shouldn't matter. This argument, the discrimination argument, is often invoked by utilitarians who privilege impartiality and fairness. As Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism said, everyone to count for one, nobody for more than one. So that is, while someone with a face elicits our sympathy more than a statistical victim, this is not morally relevant. It's arbitrary and unfair. We all have an equal claim to assistance. And these social costs to unqualified rescues mean that we are not showing respect to the rights of all healthcare users. We run the real risk of losing many more lives if our focus is only on identifiable individuals. The second point that Largent and Pearson make is that in considering treating rare diseases, we should consider diseases that are severe, progressive, and result in a decreased life expectancy if left untreated. So when it comes to the rule of rescue, the question is there normative force behind it, as opposed to it being a psychological tendency? What I mean by this is, if we look at valuing rarity, the rare disease case, many people have argued that we have a professional obligation to pursue new scientific knowledge and technological innovation. In other words, that despite the cost involved of focusing on rare diseases, we have an obligation to science to pursue treatments and research and development into solving these diseases. Similarly, we have a moral obligation to give underrepresented groups or individuals a voice. But privileging science and innovation fails to show equal concern to the needs of all. That is, if we focus on a small group of rare diseases which affect only a limited number of people in the population, those resources we could be giving to the needs of all. And so we're not showing concern to the needs of all when we privilege science and innovation. Similarly, while I agree that we do have a moral obligation to give underrepresented groups or individuals a voice, it doesn't mean that we need to take actions advocated by these groups or individuals. There's a difference in hearing what affected individuals have to say and doing what it is that they want us to do. So in this part of the discussion, I'm going to suggest that we've made a mistake by focusing on rare diseases as opposed to focusing on severity and the severity of a disease. So as Monica Margalis recently put it, it is severity, not prevalence, that drives our judgments, that important claims are being overlooked when treatments for severe rare diseases are not funded. Unlike prevalence, severity is an appropriate consideration for priority setting. In other words, what she's claiming is that it's not that our system neglects rare diseases, but that it neglects severe diseases that are rare. And she proposes a shift in focus, that we look at a severity test rather than a rarity test. So the 4 elements to this test would be how badly off a patient has been in the past, how badly off a patient is now, how badly off a patient is expected to become if not treated, and how soon a patient needs treatment to avoid a bad outcome. She proposes that if we look at these questions, we will have a much stronger moral claim and obligation to treat particular kinds of diseases as opposed to others, but not focusing so much on prevalence, but focusing on effect of the disease on the patient. She argues that giving diseases special status based on rarity means that the costs are borne by people with common diseases. And this current system of drug development unfairly neglects common diseases, burdening LMICs in particular. So the argument here is that we should focus our attention on our moral obligation to help the most vulnerable. That is, not to abandon the most severely affected individuals. If we understand this, we will understand that prevalence does not affect immediacy of danger. So the number of people affected by a particular disease does not affect the severity of that disease. Now, there are two interesting moral theories or ethical claims that could support this notion of addressing severity rather than rarity. And these are the narrative theory and fair innings. And I'm going to say a little bit about both of them in the rest of this discussion. So Sean Sinclair has explained narrative theory in the following way. We value life stories that follow certain patterns, classic patterns, which are reflected in many popular myths and stories. We are particularly averse to depriving people of the opportunity to follow some such pattern as they approach death. This means allowing them to sort out their affairs, say goodbyes to family and friends, review their life, or come to terms with death itself. Such activities carry a lot of meaning as ways of closing our life story in the right way. So I think what he's pointing to here is the idea of the natural progression of life. It begins, it goes through ups and downs, and it ends in a way that, unless in the most awful or tragic of circumstances, we have a chance to figure out the end of our life and to come to terms with death itself. And so in this, using narrative theory as a way of understanding or making decisions about whether to treat rare diseases, we consider whether that disease has the kinds of severity that would prevent people from having lives that follow particular patterns. And in this way, it's not the rarity of the disease that would determine whether we treat or don't treat, or how we treat, or to what extent we treat, but the severity of that disease, the time from diagnosis, for example, to death. I'm happy to discuss more of narrative theory when it comes to the questions, but I want to compare this with the idea of fair innings, which is the argument that maintains for healthcare resources should be distributed fairly. Every person should receive sufficient healthcare to provide them with the opportunity to live in good health for a normal span of years. It therefore supports an intuitive obligation to prioritize life-extending interventions for people who face a high risk of early death. So the fair innings argument would suggest that we prioritize the youth and those and taken with the narrative theory, that we prioritize those with the shortest life expectancy from the time of diagnosis, for example, to the time of death. And I think if we take these two approaches and we focus them on the idea of diseases that affect fewer people than what we would consider a common disease, the severity argument has a lot to offer, because in both these cases, we would treat people who had severe diseases irrespective of the prevalence or distribution of the number of people who had that particular disease. Now, the bad news is that the severity argument has not gained much traction and is not particularly popular. But I think there is a way forward, and the way forward has come in the last 2 years, and it's come since the COVID pandemic, which, of course, as we know, is anything but a rare disease. So in 2020, and Cassettle and colleagues wrote that the most desirable way of tackling rare diseases would be a strictly global approach. Nonetheless, international, let alone global cooperation seems to be beyond the reach of the current international community. And I'd like to contrast this with efforts under COVAX, where the world did cooperate and there was global communication and cooperation, which allowed us to develop the vaccine so quickly and so effectively. And so I think that there are opportunities for pharmaceutical companies, for researchers, institutions to work together to focus on tackling rare diseases and to provide more effective ways of treating them. But I do think that there's a somewhat of a red herring in the idea of tackling only rare diseases. I think the real focus should be on tackling severe diseases, irrespective of the number of people that it or they affect. Obviously, this would require some altruism on the part of pharmaceutical companies who stand to benefit with more people being affected by a particular disease than fewer. But I think that we are in a unique position now, as we've come out of the pandemic, to really push forward for a way to work together to focus on treating severe diseases as opposed to rare diseases. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and give you the opportunity to digest some of what I've said. I've intentionally left quite a lot of time for question and answers because there's a lot of both theory and perhaps controversial comments that I've made. I do want to emphasize that as a philosopher, I tend to have been trained in questioning people's answers rather than answering people's questions. So I hope I'm able to do justice to some of the comments or contributions that you may have to make. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Heidi. Do you want to keep your camera on?
Sure.
Good, excellent. All right, so lots of people on this call. Any questions for Heidi about kind of the arguments and approaches that she proposed for thinking about rare diseases versus severe diseases?
Just from my side, I see that we have many senior academics from Wits, from our UCT, and it would be lovely to hear from them and what they think. There we are. They're already starting their questions. So over to them.
Excellent. Johnny, Prof. Mhlangwa, your hand was up first, so. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so the sound is not good. We can't hear you, Prof. Johnny.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My apologies. Sorry, I was switching between the audio instruments here. And thanks, Heidi. Very, very thought-provoking. I hope you don't mind if I remain in the dark with my video off. It's actually more of a comment than a question. So some of us have spent almost our lifetime looking after both severe and rare diseases in patients. So the comment I wanted to make is that these two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It might be in a subset of patients, one is able to separate the two, but by and large, in fact, we face the severe diseases, that are very rare, and vice versa. And I just wondered if your contention will remain the same if you're faced with both of these, dichotomy in the same patient.
Thank you. So, absolutely. I think really as to emphasize, as someone who has not spent any of her time in her life dealing with people with severe and or rare diseases, my approach is to think about this in terms of the ethical considerations that I would approach in terms of the two arguments. So the utilitarian argument that we shouldn't be focusing treatment or medications on people with rare and or severe diseases, and the rule of rescue argument that we absolutely should, even if we know that this is going to in fact cause a shortage in the general population. And I think what's interesting is that if we shift the if we consider a number of cases, so if we had a mild common disease versus a mild rare disease, for example, I think most of us would probably say we should treat the mild common disease because we'll perhaps there are more people we're going to save. So all things being equal, if we've got 5 people with a mild rare disease and 5,000 people with a mild common disease, it makes more sense to treat the common disease. If we take a case where we have a severe common disease versus a severe rare disease, again, I think intuitively it makes more sense to treat the greatest number. So use the utilitarian argument to make that claim. A third option would be a severe common disease versus a mild rare disease. And here, again, treating the severe common disease seems to maximize the aggregate benefit, whereas few of us might say we should treat the mild rare disease. It doesn't seem to make any sense to treat a mild rare disease over a severe common disease. So the only case where I think it would become problematic would say in treating a mild common disease versus a severe rare disease, which is perhaps the implication of my argument. And so a utilitarian would always say treat the mild common disease because that would be affecting more people's overall happiness compared to treating the severe rare disease. I think only in that case would we diverge and say that some people would argue for treating the severe rare disease, the rule of rescue, for example, whereas others would say treating the mild common disease. And so what I'm really trying to tease out here is what is the actual concern that is driving us in these ethical considerations. Now, obviously, that's completely different when you have someone at the bedside who you know intimately and for long periods of time. But what I'm trying to point out, I think, is that rarity in and of itself is not a morally significant factor. It's the severity that's the morally significant factor. And I think if we take that seriously, then decisions about rarity become less important and there's something of a red herring. So that's really what I wanted to say in terms of patients with both severe and rare diseases. I think the real concern is the severity of the disease, not the rarity of the disease. So even when they do overlap, I'm still not sure that the rarity is the morally significant factor. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Let's assume that it did. So Peter Robenhammer, your hand was up next.
Thanks, Heidi. Peter Robenhammer here from the Department of Medicine at UCT. I want to also play philosopher a little bit and ask you a question. But I just want to start by introducing, you know, I'm amazed that 162 people on this call, I suspect mostly clinicians. And the reason they're listening is, and the reason I'm listening is because we're worried about severe disease that's killing people and we can't provide care. So there is a third arm. I'll be interested in your thoughts of that. It's not just people, or for that matter, you know, patients who are sick. There is this incredible moral injury in the clinicians, in the healthcare providers. And we're familiar with that during COVID as well. You know, should healthcare providers, are they special? Do they deserve special treatment and special consideration over and above the patient? So I'm going to introduce that as a background, but the moral harm from not treating patients with severe disease is very significant. So I think that's an overriding factor for clinicians at the bedside that we worry about. And then I want to know your thoughts about, in fact, what is our current solution to this problem? I think it's a very reasonable solution, is that we should try and offer treatments, whatever they are, as long as they're available to patients. Any treatment, no matter what the cost. However, we limit the number of people we can treat. So that means every patient potentially has access to every form of available therapy. Although, of course, not everybody will get access because the number of available therapies are limited. But in a way, and that's what we currently do, to be honest, in many situations. And in a way, I think that removes some of that moral injury, and that, you know, at least everybody has a chance of getting some injury. We're not denying therapy to everybody outright. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on those two separate issues. Thanks.
So thank you. I'm so pleased you raised that, because I mean that's my primary interest. And I think that the issue of moral injury, moral distress, I wish I had a magic wand to offer you the solution. But I think I go back to two points that I made. The one is the kind of the burden on healthcare professionals, clinicians, etc., to solve the problem, to have the ability to fix. And it comes from this push to science and technology and innovation in terms of there is a problem, we can solve it. And I think it's worth considering that narrative theory in a response to that death is unfortunately a natural outcome of our existence. And it's about the ability of the patient in this case to come to terms with that, and I think that the same thing is important for the healthcare provider, is to be able to come to terms with the fact that not everything can be solved, and that there are good deaths and bad deaths, and obviously the aim is to ensure that as many people as possible have a good death rather than or a better quality of life, if we're going to be more positive, than a poorer quality of life. But I think the idea of limiting healthcare to a smaller number, if I'm picking up the point you made, is worrying, because we know what happens when we limit healthcare to smaller numbers. Well, I mean, that's particularly in South Africa, we have a past of doing that. So I'm not sure about offering as much treatment to fewer numbers, which seems to be the opposite of a utilitarian approach. That concerns me. In terms of moral injury and moral distress, I think that to shift, it requires an approach that, I'm going to say something very controversial here. It requires an approach which is to accept the reality that we can't solve all the problems all of the time, that we live in situations where we have to make deeply troubling decisions, and moral distress comes about where we are forced to make those decisions in hugely complicated situations. So, I mean, it's going to be a problem. But I think that the solution of limiting treatments to fewer numbers is a concerning one.
Good. Peter, is there a follow-up on that, or are you satisfied with that?
No, I think we could probably have a whole conversation on that. I'll let other people ask questions.
Brilliant. Kolile Medledze, you are next on the, you had your hands up, and then I'll go to some of the questions in the chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Oli. I was waiting to hear how you pronounce it. It's actually pretty good. I'm a medical officer in the Wits circuit at Joburg Gen, currently in hematology. So my question really is, I don't know if I should say it's a question, but I'm seeking clarity on what we mean when we say severity. Perhaps I should say parameters, because are we then saying palliative care is unethical because it goes into severity, but also taking into consideration prognosis. So in light of the concepts that talks about prioritizing the vulnerable, to provide everyone with an opportunity to reach a sort of normal lifespan, are we taking into consideration prognosis as part of severity? If not, then what do we mean by severity? And also, are we also saying then we should ignore prognosis and say that, well, this patient is in a severe condition or has severe disease and should be given the opportunity to reach a normal lifespan and be given all treatment at all cost? And if we then do that, are we not doing a disservice to others that sort of have a better opportunity in light of prognosis? So I'm unclear in terms of the parameters of severity. I don't know if my question makes sense. Sorry, I'm driving as well, so that's a bit tricky. But does it make sense? If I can sort of summarize it, I can say, what are the parameters of severity? Are we then excluding or taking into consideration prognosis? And are we thus saying palliative care is unethical?
Sure. Okay. No. So if I gave the impression that I thought palliative care was unethical, that's the opposite impression of what I wanted to give.
Okay.
But I think so the idea of, if we take the narrative theory and the fair innings theory, both of those, I think, give us some parameters of how to treat severe cases. So in a toss-up between two patients, both of whom have a severe disease, rare or not rare, the issue would be which one of those two, and we have the resources to treat one and not the other, simplify it to just two patients. The fair innings theory would say, well, who is the one who's had less fair innings, who's had a shorter lifespan, and which is the one that we could offer a treatment to give them more of an opportunity to have that fair innings. So in the case of a 15-year-old over a 40-year-old with equally severe diseases, the idea would be that, all things being equal, assuming that there was some treatment that could give both of them 5 years extra or 10 years extra, the fair innings argument says treat the younger person because that person then gets more of a fair innings over the older person. So that's the one way of looking at the parameters of severity and to treat or not to treat. The other, in terms of the narrative theory, is to say, well, what is the time available to these two patients in terms of having the ability to put their affairs in order, come to terms with death, have the experiences that would allow them to experience a more recognizable pattern of a life. And then that would be the parameter. So again, taking those two examples, the one would be to say, well, this person's got 5 months, and another person's got a longer time. We treat the person with the fewer the less time, so that they can have a life extending treatment to enable them to tell the story of their life that is more in line with the patterns that we value. So in terms of parameters, I think prognosis matters, but it's prognosis for length of time, and focusing on death here, length of time that it would allow us to extend the treatment in order to have that narrative story, or length of time in order to allow that person to have more of a fair innings. So it certainly doesn't mean we throw everything at every disease, or that we don't treat any disease. I'm thinking of the example of in a resource constraint environment where treating one necessarily means not treating another. How do we make those decisions that we can live with at the end of the day?
Sorry. Thank you so much for the answer. I have just one more follow-up question. I don't know if I'm playing devil's advocate here, or, but I think if you could advise me sort of, to, like what you're saying, to make a decision that would also leave me at peace to sleep at night. If we are faced with the two examples that you made, a 15-year-old and a 40-year-old, we have these two examples that have similar conditions, but the age is different. So one might say, okay, well, a 15-year-old will then have an opportunity at life, so let me give the 15-year-old. But in a context like South Africa, the 40-year-old might be the breadwinner, and not saving him means that 15 of the people in the household then are at risk of multiple issues that come with poverty. So if you were to say to me, as someone advising me, I don't know if it's unfair on you, and I know to an extent one will use their discretion, but if you were to advise me, if I had one pack of resources and I had these two patients, what would you say to me?
Well, I mean, as I said, the point of ethics, I think, is not to be able to give the same answer in every situation. And what you've proposed there is absolutely the reason that the earlier question brought up about moral harm and moral injury, that every single case is going to have value. There's going to be value in whichever decision you make, and there's going to be disutility or unhappiness in the person you don't treat. There's no way I can say that every 15-year-old should be treated over every 40-year-old, or vice versa, every 40-year-old breadwinner should be treated over every 15-year-old. And that's what makes this so absolutely complicated and difficult to answer. But I do think that, I mean, when I pose those kinds of questions, those are incredibly simplified comparisons. The point is to be able to weigh up the arguments and decide in that moment, or under those circumstances, with a team of people who can, which makes sense in that moment. I don't know that ethics can provide absolutely concrete answers or solutions that are divorced from context. And so for me to be able to say to you, yes, always treat the 15-year-old is hugely problematic. And I could never go so far as to say that. But I think what is important in weighing up the decision who to treat is that we consider some of these arguments. We consider the argument about fair innings just as much as we consider the argument about context and reality and breadwinning and issues of that in a country like South Africa.
Thank you so much. I'm answered. Thank you.
Olile, you're answered by Heidi refusing to give you an answer. All right. So that question, Heidi, the last question actually relates to one of the questions in the chat, which is about what. So Tomek Piorkowski asked the question around to avoid too much subjectivity, what is the best framework for assessing severity? And I wonder if you want to speak a little bit about the value of kind of policies. So maybe this is what I'm thinking about, is not just a framework for assessing just severity, but the importance of doing some of this work before you get to the moment of making hard decisions.
So absolutely, thank you for that question and that comment. So I think I'm as a philosopher, an ethicist, I am in a privileged position because I get to think about these questions and these really, really hard questions away from the moment of crisis. And so on the one hand, I can almost feel the frustration in the online room about, well, what are we supposed to do at the bedside? And I think the really important work needs to be done before and at a time of non-crisis. And so, for example, in resource allocation policies, there's a lot of opportunity in South Africa to start developing these policies, to start looking at policies that have been developed elsewhere and to consider their value in our context. And I think that the value of ethics and ethical reasoning is that we do that work without the kind of pressure that clinicians such as yourselves face at the moment of crisis. I think that a clinical ethics team or a clinical ethics group could be set up in hospitals, in institutions where these kinds of discussions take place, not just when there is a crisis, but prior to a crisis. Because I think that the more policies we develop, the more opportunities we have to think through these cases away from the critical moments, the more we become confident in our critical thinking and our decision-making abilities, so that the crisis situation is avoided because we know what we're going to do when these things occur. And I mean, from the limited knowledge I have in terms of what happens in the hospital at the moment, I think there's a lot of M&M after a critical case has occurred, but I'm not sure how much prior reasoning and thinking about these issues occurs. And this is why a forum like this is really important, I think, because it gives people the opportunity to think about where they stand in relation to some of these difficult decisions. So, and to give other people opportunities to offer their focuses. So it's not really about the decision at the end of the day as much as it is about working out the reasonable arguments that could be accepted for a decision that's made at the end of the day. And I think that working together between philosophers, ethicists, clinicians, so that the burden is not on an individual or a small team of people in the moment of crisis, I think that we need to be much more proactive and start developing frameworks and policies that can really help people make decisions and also justify those decisions both to the people they make them to, but also to themselves. And to go back to Xolile's question, that will help you sleep at night, as if you've got something behind you that can support and justify your decisions, as opposed to a kind of off-the-cuff decision. These are far too important to be making in a time of crisis, as we discovered with COVID.
Thanks, Heidi. And I think one of the trends in the chat is there's quite a lot of discussion of the costs of care. So there's I think two strands to that work that probably needs to happen. The one relates to evidence, and there's different contributions, questions about, you know, has there any systematic work been done around willingness to pay for QALYs gained, for instance, at the level of the country, and shouldn't that be a priority and perhaps a priority for different diseases? There's then follow-up discussion about the importance of evidence and evidence-based decision-making, and Mark Blockman And Jacques Malherbe seemed to emphasize that point. And then there is Estelle's made a contribution saying that there is a tension between, or not a tension, there is work that needs to happen, not just about the cost of treating, but also the cost of not treating, even if the drug is expensive. And so I think as you speak about, you know, the importance of reasons, arguments, I think those I imagine are strands that you see feeding into those arguments. Is that right? Yeah.
Sure, but I mean, the privilege that we have as ethicists and philosophers is that we can spend, arguing doesn't cost money and doesn't require the kinds of interventions and research and empirical evidence that is needed. And I'm just thinking that those are two ways of approaching that ideally need to be done in collaboration with each other. But I would hate for the argument that because we don't have enough evidence, or because we don't have enough funding to conduct these kinds of evidence-based studies, that we shouldn't be doing the other work. And so I think that the work can happen by different people in different contexts, but ideally in a team-based approach, a collaborative-based approach, as opposed to philosophers thinking on one level and clinicians or researchers thinking on another.
So then there's two important strands, I think, still in the chat that you might want to speak to. One strand relates to the information that should feed into decision making and how decisions are made. So Mark Blockman refers to the importance of, I guess, procedural justice, and points out that explicit rationing versus implicit rationing, and it's really important, I guess, the suggestion would be to ensure that rationing is explicit, not implicit. Maybe you want to speak to that. And then contributions that say what in addition to the model that you propose, what should also be taken into consideration is the efficacy of treatment. So regardless of just cost, efficacy is very important. So I don't know if you want to speak to those two. I think that's what
Sure. So I'll take the second one first. Absolutely. I mean, I think that we don't have the luxury of focusing purely on cost, that it has to be a balance between efficacy, and that, I mean, I think I mentioned earlier in the discussion that there needs to be a real commitment to involving patients in that discussion, and particularly the short-term and long-term discussions about that, because if we go to a rare disease, for example, that is severe but perhaps not life-threatening, at least imminently, there are real concerns about long-term treatments and long-term benefits versus short-term benefits, and so efficacy would definitely be something that couldn't, I don't think, not be included in a cost-benefit analysis. In terms of Mark's question about procedural justice, I mean, I think it's absolutely critical in terms of respect for humans to make these kinds of decisions and decision-making explicit. And that goes back to the idea of having policies so that it is not the decision-making of the individual clinician that is being scrutinized by the patient or the family or the situation. Policies are, I think, incredible protections, not just in terms of litigation or decision-making, but in terms of ensuring that there is transparency in the decision-making process. And it would be highly problematic for me to have the kinds of thinking about decision-making that isn't explicit. And that's why, I mean, we've talked, for example, with our third-year medical students about the kidney resource allocation policy. And it's not a perfect policy, for example, but it's a starting point, and it at least makes things explicit so that there are not I suppose, the opposite of transparency, that there are not expectations by people for things that are unrealistic and impossible. So absolutely, the procedural justice requires that we make things explicit.
Great. I see that Estelle posted another question, and I'm not sure that I completely understood it, but I want to go to a question that Caroline Stein asked. Shifane Chapanduka, you're not muted. I don't know if you want to speak. Have you? I don't know if that's accidental. No, okay, cool. That was accidental. Okay. Want to go to a question that Caroline Stein posted, which is about the way in which decisions are made and the availability, I guess, of clinical ethics support. So she says that occasionally, with a very difficult or ethically challenging situation, she'd like to have someone to discuss this with. Is there such a service in South Africa? And what would be the options, I guess? I wonder if you want to, I'm sure you've got something to say on that, but.
So I don't know that I can't speak for the whole of South Africa and the availability of such services throughout. I do know that in certain institutions, UCT, for example, it's more of when difficult decisions like this have to be made, as far as I understand it, it's more of an ad hoc kind of approach to it. I mean, in international institutions, there are clinical bioethicists who have training, who've done years of, who often have a medical background and then a bioethics postgraduate kind of training, and those come together. I mean, there are numbers of examples, but generally in higher resourced places. That's not to say it can't be done. And I absolutely think it's critical that it should be done, because these are the kinds of decisions that will increasingly occur and will increasingly contribute to moral injury and moral harm among clinicians. And so, I mean, in a perfect world, we would both have enough resources to treat rare and or severe diseases, but we would also have enough resources to set up these kinds of committees, or at least consultation opportunities for clinicians and healthcare practitioners to be able to consult with teams of people with expertise. In the absence of that, I do think that having, whether it's formal or informal sounding boards for these kinds of discussions, clinical ethics forums, conversations in ethics, for example, that give people from a variety of backgrounds the opportunity to have these discussions away from the bedside, is critically important. And that doesn't cost a lot of money. That costs a lot of time, which I know is a limited resource in itself. But I think the more we can get administrators, deans, managers, etc., to buy into this idea that these kinds of decisions are best made as part of a team, the more chance we have of simply coming to better decisions, not necessarily always the right decisions, but better decisions, and the more chance we have of sharing the load and reducing that burden on individual clinicians to have to make these decisions. And again, that's where policy comes in. So I think both pre the decisions, informal discussions like these can really produce important considerations, not necessarily a handbook of what to do in this particular situation compared to that particular situation, but at least the opportunity to take into consideration varying views, which help to make the decision at the end.
Wonderful. And just to maybe add to that, to say that I think there is an opportunity there for some concerted effort and discussions around the need for integration of ethics into practice, because I think until we're starting to kind of universally make that claim, these things don't change. And I mean, we've seen that in our own immediate environment, right? Is the work of integrating ethics and clinical ethics into the hospital can take quite a long time. And so for all of you on the call, I think it's really important to start thinking about, well, what would that look like? And how can we all work to make that a greater, a better reality in our setting. Estelle, you've got the last question. I wonder if you want to speak to it, or if that was just a comment.
Yeah, I don't want to distract from the very beautiful ethical sort of moral imperatives we're discussing, but I'm just saying that you started out with that, the fact that we are extremely, you spoke about Diana's crash, you spoke about the tsunami. These things draw, but we as clinicians see a patient before us all the time. And it's very, very difficult for us to know when we should, it's a really hard thing to decide when hope is too much. And I'm just saying that because you also spoke to the fact that we don't prevent or diagnose early necessarily, but we actually often treat after, late and after the fact. And that's just something that, I think is very important for Africa, that people are diagnosed early. And obviously that includes rare diseases, rare severe diseases. But in renal medicine, there is, in this country, we do not dialyze after a specific age. Much more difficult in the field of many other common diseases and rare diseases. And I think with rare disease, I will just keep saying it's the cost. We can say a lot of things, but the cost is a big, big problem, which is insurmountable in a sense. And that needs to be, as Mark Blockman has also said, what it was, the word would be implicit versus explicit. I'm sure, sorry, I don't know if I have the right words, rationing, the clarity. So there's a lot of room for talking about these things. That's just what I thought. That's my, so the question, it is a question actually, how do we solve this? But there's a lot of room for talking and for discussion and thinking and perhaps really speaking to colleagues if we are in difficult situations. We sometimes treat things, but we're not quite sure where we are going. And perhaps that they, as Caroline said, perhaps there should be a forum right there and then, and difficult to do. So.
Absolutely. And if I can just add, I mean, I don't know that, I think if we start off by feeling that the problems are insurmountable, it is tempting to say, well, we can't do it, so we'll just stick with the status quo. But it's quite clear from an outsider's perspective that the status quo isn't working. And this idea of talking to each other and asking for help is something so I'm hearing so often, and from so many different kinds of groups of people, that they can't, not everyone can't be wrong. So the idea of having more discussions, of not necessarily being focused on the solution that will fix everything, but on focusing on how to have these kinds of hard discussions in ways that can allow us, as Solile beautifully put it, sleep at night. And to accept that there are certain things that are unchangeable. But there are certain things that aren't. And I think ending with that COVAX suggestion was there are opportunities for collaboration. There are opportunities to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies, on institutions, and so on. And if we're all pushing in the same direction, then there can be some opportunity for change.
Thank you, Heidi.
Wonderful, Heidi. So I think that's all the questions there were for you today. So thank you so much for preparing an excellent talk. Wonderful. You get some lovely feedback on the chat, saying it was valuable and thought-provoking. So thank you very much for taking the time to prepare this presentation and to help this crowd think through the variety of arguments that can be brought to bear in this discussion. And thanks to all the participants and to Estelle and team for hosting this.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Jantine and to Heidi. I hope that we are going to continue this conversation, and we'd love to hear from everybody in the meeting. Let us know if you want to continue these kind of conversations. They're very important, very, very helpful. I've learned a lot, and I hope that it will help us, as Olele said, to sleep at night, sleep better, and our patients too, because that's the important thing. They must also sleep. So good. Thank you very much, and we would love to welcome you back. And thank you, Mark Blockman, also for your input and for your support in building our moral resilience. Is that what you call it, Heidi? Yeah.
Well, not just me, hopefully a lot of people.
Thank you, Mark. And yeah, so you agree, Mark, we'll keep on. We'll keep on keeping on and talk about this.
Absolutely. The conversation and collaboration is the most important, so we can come to good decisions and reduce our moral harm. I think it's really important.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to everybody, and have a good evening.